Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's briefing on the new indices. I am Christine Chua, your host for today. Last Monday, March 28, 2022, PSE launched two new thematic indices, the PSE Dividend Yield Index and the PSE MidCap Index. Today, we'll discuss why PSE chose to introduce these two indices, how they are different from the PSEi and other existing indices, and how listed companies are selected to be constituents of these 20-member indices. Our speaker for today is the head of the Market Data Department. The Market Data Department safekeeps historical trading data, handles the creation of data-related reports, and liaises with data vendors and market participants for data subscription. Please welcome Ms. Regina Crisostomo. GIA's team spearheaded the creation and launch of the new indices. Gia, over to you.
Thank you, Prissy. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. Today, we'll be discussing the newly launched indices of the PSE. To provide an overview of the presentation, we'll first begin with a short introduction on market indices and the PSE's existing indices. Then we'll proceed with a discussion on the PSE Dividend Yield Index and the PSE MidCap Index. To start, what is a market index? An index is composed of a basket or group of select stocks that represent the stock market or a particular sector or theme. It tracks the performance of the market and usually indicates market trends. It is also usually used by investors to track the performance of their portfolio or to compare the performance of their portfolio to the market. And also, indices are used by fund managers to benchmark or track for their mutual funds or exchange-traded funds. Prior to the launch of the new indices, there were 8 indices in the PSE Index series, the first and most widely used of which is the PSE Index or the PSEi, which is the main or benchmark index of the Philippine stock market. It is composed of the 30 largest and most liquid common stocks in the PSE. In 2019, we launched the Total Return Index or TRI counterpart of the PSE Index. The TRI considers gains from reinvestment of dividends aside from capital gains. As there are 6 sector indices, there are 6 sectors in the PSE, there are also 6 sector indices. There is no fixed number of constituents for these indices. Lastly, we have the All Shares Index, which includes all common stocks of listed companies in the PSE main board, or all common stocks except for the companies listed in the SME or the Small, Medium, and Emerging board. Last March 28, we launched 2 new thematic indices. So what is a thematic index? It's an index that tracks the performance of a group of companies that is tied to a specific investment theme. It usually captures companies across multiple sectors. Themes may include popular trading strategies such as dividend investing or investing based on environmental, social, and governance or ESG scores, as well as it may be tied with religion such as Sharia indices and many others. For the PSE, we first launched the PSE Dividend Yield Index and the PSE MidCap Index. As the name suggests, the PSE Dividend Yield Index focuses on companies that regularly give dividends to their investors, while the PSE MidCap Index focuses on companies that the next best companies after the PSEi. So why did we launch these indices? First, to provide investors additional alternative benchmarks based on their trading strategies. Second, to provide a benchmark for existing dividend-based funds and hopefully pave the way for the creation of new ETFs or investment funds. And lastly, to generate additional volume for companies included in the new indices that are not currently members of the PSEi. We also conducted a benchmarking study with peer exchanges, and we found that most ASEAN and Asia-Pacific exchanges already have these 2 indices. In terms of constituent count, the number really varies and highly depends on the size of the exchange or the number of listed companies in the exchange. In terms of selection criteria, exchanges usually look at existing membership in indices, as this already considers liquidity and enough free float. For dividend yield index, exchanges usually, of course, looks at dividend yields. And for the mid-cap index, they look at market capitalization. For the calculation methodology, the dividend yield index is usually dividend yield adjusted, while the mid-cap index is free float market uses free float market capitalization. For the index capping, several markets cap the index weights for the dividend yield index. However, most of the markets do not cap the weights for the mid-cap indices. We'll discuss more on these two last items in the next slides. So now that we're done with the basics, let's proceed with a discussion on the dividend yield index. How are companies selected to become members of the dividend yield index? We look at four main factors, the first two of which are the same as the PSEi, where free float or public ownership should be at least 15%, and liquidity should be among the top 25% in terms of median daily value. As a dividend yield index, of course, we look at dividends. Companies must have regularly issued cash dividends for the past 3 consecutive years. However, for years with significant or non-recurring events that hindered companies from paying out dividends to their investors, such as the 2020 start of the pandemic, we may opt not to consider this particular year in the period of review. Lastly, we look at listing history. The company must have been listed for at least 12 months during the period in review. However, since we know that REITs are mandated by law to pay out dividends to their investors, we've reduced the listing history requirement for REITs to at least 6 months. Later, you'll see that a REIT company has been included in the dividend yield index. For the final selection, we rank the companies in terms of 3-year average dividend yield and take the top 20 companies as members of the PSE Dividend Yield Index. So how is the dividend yield index calculated? This slide may seem overwhelming, but what we want you to learn from this is that the index is calculated using dividend yield adjusted free float market capitalization. So this means that the higher the company's dividend yield and the higher the company's free float or public ownership, then the higher the part of its market capitalization is considered in the computation of the index. Also, we note here the introduction of a capping factor. The PSE Dividend Yield Index is actually the first PSE index that where the index weights are capped. So what is index capping? At the start of each recomposition, the constituent weights are capped so that the largest companies cannot weigh more than 10%. Why do we do the index capping? You may have noticed in the previous slides that in the selection criteria, market capitalization is not considered. So the index may be composed of a mix of large cap, small cap, and mid cap companies. Capping is done to normalize the weights and reduce concentration risk from large cap companies. And it also prevents steep price movements from largely capitalized companies from significantly affecting index movements. So how do we do the capping? If you look at the table on the right, the uncapped weights of the top 3 constituents of the index are greater than 10%. So at the start of the recomposition, we compute for an adjustment or the capping factor to decrease those weights to 10%. Then the rest of the remaining or the excess weights are then redistributed to the rest of the constituents. So we can see here that the weights for companies D to J all increased after the companies A to C's weights were capped at 10%. We also note that in the market consultations we've done with market participants, some of them mentioned that their index funds, VULs, or insurance funds have allocation limits per security. So this capping would also help fund managers meet their allocation restrictions. As you may have already seen in our press releases and our memos in the website. This is the latest list of constituents for the PSE Dividend Yield Index. You may see here familiar names, but you can also see here that there are 7 out of the 20 that are not currently PSEi members. Also, the first REIT, A-REIT, has been included in this index. These are the companies ranked according to dividend yield. You may be wondering why some companies who issue high dividend yields are not included in the index. This is largely because of the liquidity and free float criteria. So how did the index perform in the past 11 years? We conducted a back test and these are the results. So the orange line here shows the performance of the PSE Dividend Yield Index Dividend Yield Total Return Index, while the blue line shows the performance of the PSEi Total Return Index. Why are we comparing using total return? Since the dividend yield index focuses on dividends, we wanted to show the effect of the dividends or the dividend reinvestments in the levels of the index. So here we can see that from a base level of 1,000 as of the end of 2010, the index increased to 2,600 by the end of March 2022. Or this translates to an average increase per year of 8.2% versus PSEi's 7.1%. You can also see here that the PSE Dividend Yield Index dividend yield is much higher than the PSEi's. We also compared the top 10 constituents of the PSE Dividend Yield Index with the top 10 constituents of existing dividend-based funds. So the information here, you'll see here, were based on PSE's computation of dividend yield and the weights in the dividend fund's key information disclosures. As you can notice here, most of the top 10 constituents of the dividend-based funds are still PSEi securities. And unfortunately, some of these securities have low dividend yields. Thus, the average dividend yields for these dividend-based funds are also quite low. We also noticed that only a few of these dividend-based funds considered REITs in their selection. We thought that in the absence of the dividend, an available benchmark or a dividend index, funds still use the PSEi as benchmark for their indices. So the tendency would be to try to track or outperform their benchmark. So even if they sacrifice the dividend yields. So with the launch of the PSE Dividend Yield Index, we hope that funds would be more encouraged to choose more high dividend yielding stocks. Now let's proceed with the discussion on the MidCap Index. How are companies selected for the MidCap Index? Also 4 factors. The first is the free float, which requires at least 15% public float. Liquidity is a bit looser at 35%. For the market cap, we look at the company's market cap should be among the top 95% of cumulative MCAP of eligible companies. And for listing history, the company must have been listed for at least 12 months during the period in review. For the final selection, we rank the companies according to full market capitalization and remove the PSEi and take the top 20 as the constituents of the MidCap Index. In terms of calculation, the index is calculated similarly to the PSEi, which uses free float market capitalization. So here, the higher the free float or the public ownership of the company, the higher part of its market capitalization is included in the computation of the index. So here's the current list of constituents for the MidCap Index. We can see here that some of the members have been previous members of the PSEi, but we can also see here that some are new names. Here's the list of companies ranked by market capitalization, where DMC has the highest VWAP market cap and FLI has the lowest. In terms of index performance, the orange line here shows the performance of the PSE MidCap Index, while the dark blue line shows the performance of the PSEi, and the light blue line shows the performance of the MSCI Philippines Small Cap Index. So since this is a new index and the constituents are mutually exclusive with the PSEi, we can't really compare the performance with the PSEi. So we looked for the closest comparable index for now, which is the MSCI Philippines Small Cap Index. So here we can see that from a base level of 1,000 in 2010, the mid-cap index increased to 1,202 by the end of March 2022, or around 1.5% increase per year for the past 10 years. We also compared the top 10 constituents of the PSE MidCap versus the MSCI Philippines Small Cap Index. The MSCI Philippines Small Cap Index is composed of 22 securities, and 6 of which are currently PSEi members. The rest of the 4 top 10 constituents are also members of the MidCap Index. So in summary, here's a table showing the comparison between the PSEi and the new indices. In terms of listing criteria, we require 12 months of listing history with early inclusion for the PSEi and Dividend Yield Index. In terms of free float, at least 15% is required. However, we note that come December 2022, this would be increased to 20%. In terms of liquidity, PSEi and the PSE dividend yield are the same, where the company must be among the top 25% in terms of median daily value per month for 9 out of the 12 months, while this is looser for the PSE MidCap, where the company must be among the top 35%. In terms of final selection, companies are ranked according to market capitalization for the PSEi and the PSE MidCap, while for the PSE dividend yield, companies are ranked according to 3-year average dividend yield. In terms of number of constituents, the PSEi has 30, while the PSE dividend yield and the PSE MidCap both have 20 constituents. In terms of index weight calculation, both PSEi and PSE MidCap Index use free float market capitalization, while the PSE dividend yield uses dividend yield adjusted free float market capitalization. In terms of index capping, the index weights are not capped for the PSEi and PSE MidCap Index, but for the PSE Dividend Yield Index, the index weights are capped at 10%. Lastly, for the period of review, all indices are reviewed semi-annually every February and August of the year. That's all from me. Thank you, everyone, and see you again later.
We will now be answering questions from our audience. We have our first question for Ms. Gia. If companies are only required to be listed for at least a year to be eligible for the PSE Dividend Yield Index, what would be the basis for its ranking in terms of 3-year average dividend yield?
Okay, we look at the company's dividend yield while for the period that it has been listed. Also, we look at the dividend policy of the company. So if it has a clear and fixed policy for distribution of dividends, then the company may still be considered for inclusion in the PSE Dividend Yield Index, even in the absence of a 3-year average dividend yield figure.
You mentioned that the weights for the PSE Dividend Yield Index is capped at 10%. Does this mean that the weight for the company is fixed at 10% until the next review? Gia, please answer these questions as well.
No, the weight is not fixed at 10%. So since we do the capping at the start of the recomposition, the price movements of the company may affect its weight, so it can increase to more than or less than 10% during the period. However, we do the capping again at the start of the next recomposition period.
Next question is for Sir Mark. Can the PSE MidCap Index be used to determine future inclusion in the PSEi?
I would say not necessarily, because of the higher liquidity requirements for the PSEi inclusion. But I think in terms of market cap, it could be a potential indicator, but again, it does not guarantee future inclusion. So companies will have to just make sure to continue to monitor their liquidity based on the differences in requirements.
For Ms. Chia, are there funds, local and offshore, who manifested their interest in setting up index funds that will follow these two new indices by the PSE?
So we've conducted market consultations prior to the launch of the index, and based on our consultations with them, with the market participants and several fund managers, they seem to be interested naman to adapt the both indices.
If a company is removed from the PSEi, will it be automatically be included in the PSE MidCap Index?
No, not automatically. We would still have to check the 4 factors mentioned earlier: the free float, liquidity, listing history, and market capitalization. So if it passes all the criteria mentioned and it belongs to the top 20 after the PSEi, then the company will be included in the MidCap Index. As we've seen earlier in the current list of constituents, some of them have already been members of the PSEi Index.
And finally, for Sir Mark, what are the other indices in the PSE's pipeline? As we are now have MidCap Index, would we see a small cap index soon? Also, are there any plans to launch an ESG index?
Yeah, for future index plans, we want to see how this mid-cap index would perform first, and interest in terms of new funds being created out of it before we create a small cap. There would be several factors that would probably influence our decision. There has to be investors that would be interested in tracking any new indices that we launch, and also for ESG in particular, since the several ESG criteria are still quite all over the place, we want something that would be globally acceptable to a lot of investors. There's actually an ASEAN initiative here to somehow align several ESG indicators that are being reported by listed companies. So we'd probably have to wait for that to be finalized first before we explore any potential creation of an ESG index. What we are also thinking in the pipeline would be a REIT index once I guess there are enough REITs listed to warrant the creation of its own index. For now, we just included them first in the dividend yield index. And the next is a preferred share index as well. I understand this is not a very liquid asset class, but at the same time, it has its own benefits, but that investors might find interesting for an index to track the performance of such a preferred share asset class.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vista and Ms. Crisostomo. On behalf of the Philippine Stock Exchange, Inc., thank you for joining the briefing on PSE's new indices. If you have further clarifications or requests, please reach out to our market data department by sending an email to market.data@pse.com.ph.